So yeah, what I want to talk about this afternoon is the stuff we can do on top of those standards. It's not so much product and software as philosophy. What capability comes about when everything is data, everything's a computer, and everything's on the network. So Broadcast Bionics has been going for about 25 years, and we have the privilege of working with broadcasters large and small in over 100 countries, and we control the communication and the interaction between those broadcasters and a little over 1.5 billion households a month. So it's a little bit more than half of the population of the planet. I say that not to big us up, but to big up radio and television. Everybody, and me included, talks about social media and the future of communication. But in fact, radio still reaches 80 to 90% of people in most first world countries, and it can still reach illiterate populations in places that simply no other form of media can reach. So radio is really, really good. But we have a bit of a problem because our audiences are changing. The way we consume information, the way we interact with information is changing. So I've had the privilege of talking with broadcasters, with broadcast manufacturers and groups all over the world. And the question I've asked virtually every single time is this: what was the first thing you touched when you woke up this morning? Careful how you answer that if you're traveling. Some of you are making up your own jokes, but I'll move on to the fact that for about 80 to 90% of us, the first thing you touch when you wake up, even if you wake up in bed with your significant other, is your phone or your device. So you've just eaten, it's warm, we're in the afternoon. If you don't get any further through my talk than this could change your life. The rest could change your radio, this could change your life. When you wake up with somebody who you've promised to spend the rest of your life with, whom you used to love, cherish and obey, if you touch them before you touch your phone, if you make them the last thing that you touch before you go to bed, I promise that will change everything. But for 80 to 90% of us, we touch the phone as the very first thing we touch. In fact, you touch your phone 2,671 times a day. Not individual sessions, that's swipes and touches on average. You use it for over 5 hours a day. Pretty soon we'll use the phone and mobile devices more than we're asleep. They're incredibly important. So that means that the habits of our audiences, and more importantly, the habitats that they're inhabiting, are changing radically. And in order to get our content onto those devices, we have to reconsider the whole way that our content is produced and consumed. My job is to equip the industry, and my job is to challenge the industry. My job is to make sure that we're creating compelling, original, creative content that people want to consume. My job is to make sure that we can fit that content for the purposes and the platforms that the audience now want to consume it on. And yes, when I have my more commercial moments, my job is to make sure that we're able to provide the insight and the analytics to measure and monetize what broadcasters are doing across those platforms. It's as simple as this. If we have no content, we have no business. If we have no audience, we have no business. If we have no advertisers because they've gone somewhere else, we have no business. All of this is changing the entire way that society works. Ben Cooper, the controller of Radio 1, spoke about how people can be together but apart, like this pair on the sofa. But equally, you can be apart but together. The whole way that we interact with each other, the whole way that our society works, and the whole way we share information between each other has changed radically in just the last 5 years. But this is a geeky kind of technical crowd, and you want to know what this means for the way that we make radio, the way that we build our studios. Well, I'm a pretty geeky person, and my first job in technology was in the equivalent of high school. I had a Saturday job selling hi-fis. I'll date myself now, this was the mid-1980s, and in the mid-1980s, this is what hi-fis looked like, ladies and gentlemen. They were magnificent. They had a graphic equalizer for no reason other than it added buttons. They had a spectrum analyzer for no reason than you could charge more based on the number of lights and physical controls and buttons you had on all these devices. Because, ladies and gentlemen, that's what technology used to look like. More buttons, more technology. More lights, more technology. Fast forward to this year, that's the iPhone 10. 4 buttons. Apple just spent $1 billion getting the one button off the front of the device. That device, the iPhone 10, has Ultra HD cameras on the front and back. It has 3D recognition of my face. It has a GPS. It has a color touchscreen on the front of it. I can use it for navigation, I can use it for video editing, I can use it for social media, I can use it for email, I can, even if I'm desperate, use it as a phone. Most of us just hold down the button on the front and use it as a torch. But it's a pretty high-tech device with 4 buttons, no manual. That's what technology looks like today. So I'm not speaking out of school. I've shown the next slide and I've said what I'm about to say to broadcasters large and small, including the people who own the studio I'm about to show you. If that's what technology looks like, why do our radio studios still look like 1980s hi-fis? That Studio 82D on the 8th floor of New Broadcasting House, it's about 5 years old and they're about to refresh it. It's a really, really good studio for a national broadcaster. But to me, I'm sorry, and I've said it to their faces, that looks like a 1980s hi-fi. Do we really need every button and control in that studio in parallel? Especially if I show you what radio studios used to look like in the 1930s. Are we sure we're using technology correctly when in the rest of the world we've used technology to make things simpler, whereas somehow we went from the 1930s to now and added all of this? Are we sure that all of that stuff is strictly necessary? Can anybody really eagle-eyed show? So this is a radio studio. I have a source of music, I have a talk show system, I have a microphone, I have a console. Can anybody notice the one thing we have managed to remove in our digital studios? Say again? The bottle and the ashtray, exactly. So in about 50 years, we've got rid of the ashtray, but we've added all of this other stuff. I don't think that's a good use of technology, especially when everything in that studio you just looked at was a computer. The playout system is a computer, the console is a computer, the talk show system is a computer, the scheduling system is a computer. Everything in that studio is data. It's all digital. It's all on the network. So if everything's a computer and everything's data and everything's on the network, why haven't we managed to change the rest of it? Well, people come to me and they say, well, it's the users. The talent likes the console the way that it is. They have to have every physical control. Every one of those knobs and lights is absolutely essential. So we're involved with a project within the BBC called the Internet Fit Radio Studio, and we're helping to design and develop along with them how radio studios perhaps might look and function in the future to make content which is fit for the internet. We'll talk a little bit about that later on. But one of the first times I went into that studio, Dave Walters, the head of technology, shared with me something that I promised on that day I would share with every audience I speak to over at least the next couple of years, because it changed the entire way that I, as a designer, think about the way we build technology as a company and the way that we're going to build studios. And it's this. The BBC, very wisely and sagely, when they wanted to build this studio, thought, let's not just go to technologists to figure out what's possible technically, but let's go to the producers and presenters right across the BBC and ask them what they want from the studios of the future. And they did whatever it is that creatives do, smoked some cigarettes, drank some Chianti, and they came back with several pages of really, really good advice. And Dave and his team totaled it all up, and they were astonished to find that there was really only 2 core things which were head and shoulders above everything else that people were asking for. And I am under NDA with the BBC, but they have allowed me to share this with you. So I think you should probably write this down. This is the BBC's secret design principle for all studios of the future. It's these simple 2 things: cushions and daylight. That was it. That's what the users of our studios asked for from the studios of the future. They didn't say it has to be AES 67. They didn't mention SMPTE 2110. They know it has to be those things. But they're asking for us to use that technology in a much better way. What they want is studios that when you walk into them have cushions and daylight. Now that was a bit awkward, so the BBC had to go back and say, well, it's sort of BBC R&D and technology, we would like a technical answer to that question. And they said, we can do better. We don't have to give you these 2 things, I can give you just one technical piece of advice. This is what we want, technically speaking, from our studios of the future. They just have to work. So we, as engineers and technologists, need to be designing studios that just work the way that our users do. You know what, when you look at one of those big consoles, it doesn't look high-tech to somebody from the iPad generation. It looks like it fell off the Mir space station. That's not what technology looks like anymore. That's not what the good and sensible application of technology looks like anymore. We can do better than that with the way we design our studios. So I've been talking to broadcasters for several years about what we call the social studio. That's a studio which is connected to, is engaging its audience. But we started now talking about what we call the Bionic studio. This is an intelligent studio using and applying intelligent technology, machine learning, artificial intelligence, transcription, the tricks we've been pulling, but to make a studio that isn't passive, that isn't dumb, but it's bionic. It's listening to what you're doing, it's watching what you're doing, it's learning from what you're doing, and it's reacting to that. It's an active part of producing compelling content. It's helping automatically to fit that content for those platforms and those applications that we have to serve. And it's making sure the entire while that it's helping to generate that insight, all those analytics, to understand what you're doing and allow us to go to our advertisers, to our sponsors, or in fact to our listeners or viewers, and give them an entirely new interactive experience through searching and serendipity. So that's what we call the Bionic Studio. If you're familiar with Phonebox, our previous products, it's also a rebrand and a rename of the Broadcast Bionic's Phonebox client in the studio is now known as Bionic Studio. Essentially, Phonebox was confusing Americans. We had this incredible product, it did all these amazing things, and it was called Phonebox because 25 years ago when we started doing it, it was designed to be a talk show system, and then we added visualization and we added this and we added that, and it didn't really make any sense. So we're also producing apps which allow you in the studio to use other devices. We try to get the information away from all those PCs and screens in the studio and onto your mobile phone or onto your iPad. So we're not surrounding people continually, not just with more and more knobs and buttons. It's easy. You know, what we did in radio technology is we took analog devices and we replaced an analog box with a digital box. And then we went, oh, we can emulate that in a computer, and we took a computer and we emulated a digital box which was emulating an analog box. We can pull all of that content and all of that information out of the computers and put it onto your phone, to put it onto an iPad to make it available in the studio. So what does all that actually look like? What do I mean by a Bionic Studio? Well, one trick we've been pulling for a while in radio studios is as simple as this. We wanted to make them smarter. We wanted to have them listen to what's going on. So if you're in, this is BBC Radio 1's breakfast show, if you're in there, it's a music station, right? So if you click on the smart cue, we're playing Katy Perry, we're about to play Lady Gaga, and then Harry Styles. Here I can see that the computer has automatically gone to those three music artists, found their official Facebook and Twitter feeds, and pulled content towards the studio. Or we were in Sydney last week, so I can pull up information about where we are and start to pull that towards the studio. You wouldn't hire a producer and have them produce your show, but sit in a soundproof box at the end of the hall and not listen to what you're doing. But we've put up with technology that hasn't been paying attention, that isn't what we call context aware. So when the technology in the studio is aware of the context, where are you, what show are you making, what format is it, what music are you playing, then that was the beginnings of making things that were smart. But we wanted to make it one step smarter than that. So for a while we've been helping radio stations to visualize, to put pictures onto radio to make their content shareable, and we'll talk a lot more about why we do that a little bit later on. But we suddenly realized that we had audio and video from all the studios we were working with, so maybe we could do something more. What we could do is automatically switch video. This is Radio X, Chris Miles' show in London. But when we go to the video, why not transcribe the audio that goes with the video in a really time-accurate way? So, for example, if I just click over here on the word Dominic, that's where we are.
Dominic's got a bit of a man crush on.
Or I can go and search for some other piece of content, either through this particular link or somewhere else. And I say, it's not just transcribed, I know where it is.
Oh, yeah, God, he does. And therefore... Yeah.
So imagine we've now taken everything you did live in the studio, we have video, we have audio, and it's entirely searchable right through your archive. So I click on a word and click play.
So Jack was wearing a hoodie the other day. There was a pen hoodie.
So let's say this was a really funny radio link. I can just click on the word therefore, make that the in cue, click on the word Twitch, make that the out cue, click on the share button. We've put a pre-roll on, we've put a post-roll on, and I can send that straight to Facebook, to YouTube, to Twitter, etc. That's what radio looks like when we start to be smarter about saying there's all this information that's there. When we transcribe the audio and we turn it into text, let's be clever about the way that we enable you to use that text. When we listen to the music that you play, let's react to that. Let's use the context to do smarter things. So that's what a Bionic Studio is doing. It's listening to what's happening, it's transcribing it, it's understanding it, and then it's enabling us to do all of these cleverer things to make it a smart studio down the line. It's also watching what you're doing. Now, yes, this is radio, and the content that you're creating is all about the audio. And when I speak all over the world, I have to say, I love radio, I love the intimacy, I love the immediacy, I love everything about it. I'm not saying you have to change it. I'm not saying you have to make crap television. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that we have to put pictures on the content that you have in order to make them shareable. Because when you share them, they become incredibly powerful, just like this clip from LBC.
I don't understand. What is he or she getting? 80 million divided by 10,000 equals 8,000. So, what are these police officers going to be paid?
We will be paying them the average...
Has this been thought through?
Of course it's been thought through.
Where are the figures?
The figures are that the additional cost in year one, when we anticipate recruiting about 250,000 policemen, will be 64.3 million.
250,000 policemen?
And women.
So you're getting more than 10,000. You're recruiting 250,000.
No, we are recruiting 2,000 and perhaps 250. And the cost...
So where did 250,000 come from?
I think you said that, not me.
No, I can assure you said that figure because I wrote it down.
The entire video of that is available online, and it's about 8.5 minutes long. Now, let me be absolutely clear. What you just watched is a classic piece of radio. It is essentially a fat middle-aged man in a room talking to himself. Diane Abbott, the Home Secretary, isn't even there. This was the middle of the UK general election campaign, and ladies and gentlemen, in the UK, we didn't leave it to the Russians. It was radio that changed the outcome of the election. To this very day, doing a Diane Abbott is now in the Oxford English Dictionary for essentially not knowing your numbers. That was a piece of radio. The live audience for that piece of radio for LBC is somewhere between 600 and 800,000 listeners. By the end of that day, I decry you to find a single man, woman and child in the UK who hadn't seen that video clip, around 40 million people. More importantly, that video clip was the lead item of the headline news of every major news organisation in the UK. How? It was a classic piece of radio. We had no idea in advance that was going to happen. It was a boring announcement of somebody down the line over ISDN. But she screwed up the figures and it became the most compelling and most shared clip that LBC has ever had. And it changed the course of an election. This guy is another guy in a room talking to himself, James O'Brien. Wouldn't work perhaps in America. He's a left-wing shock jock. He takes calls in, again, it's just him in a room talking to the callers. But his rants, or perhaps him verbally sparring or intellectually sparring with his audience, are often viewed by 2, 3, 4 million people. Again, live audience, 810,000, including 166,000 people aged 15 to 34. The success of the clips, though, that he's sharing is attracting a much younger audience. So we have the content that people want. What we have to do is to put the hooks on it to make it shareable. There's no natural habitat for sharing audio-only content. When did you last search on Google and the answer that came back was a piece of audio? When did you last scroll through your timeline in Facebook and what came up was a piece of audio? It just doesn't happen. So it can be as boring as a man in a room talking to himself, but if we put pictures on it, the pictures are the carrier that puts it on the platforms and the places that reach the generations that want to engage with our content. So when I'm working with broadcasters and we talk about what makes a viral content, what makes radio shareable, yes, we have to put pictures on it, but then we have to make the right content available. And the trick or the secret to that is this. People don't share your content because they love Z100 or your brand. People share your content because they want to reward their friends. I've invented a new phrase for this, which I may have some t-shirts made. It's called emotional incontinence. So we now live in an emotionally incontinent world. If I feel something, I have to share it with everybody. If I laugh, I want everyone to laugh. If I cry, I want everyone to cry. If I'm happy, everyone happy. If I'm angry, everybody else happy. That's how it works. So consider the way that you're making media towards an emotionally incontinent audience. If I tell Simon that Radio New Zealand has a show at 3 p.m. next Thursday, he will get some information. It is a fact. He's received it. He's very, very unlikely to share that fact. That's how branding uses the internet. If I make him laugh and I make the clip available, he'll share it with everybody. It's as simple as that. So stop using social media as part of a branding exercise and start instead making it a way for your audience to share your content in a way that delights their friends. It's incredibly powerful, and more importantly, it's the way that Facebook and others are changing their entire algorithms. If your brand is putting out lots of clickbait and listicles, Facebook will punish you. You won't appear in people's timelines. If you're pushing out emotionally engaging content that people like and share, you'll appear way, way up there. It's a really, really good way for your brand to get its message out and to go through the audience you already have to their friends and their family. So be watching what happens, be visualizing it and making it available, because that's what makes shareable radio. We're also doing a few other things. So we're actually not just watching to visualize, but we're recognizing using face recognition what happens in the studio. So now we have, remember, transcription of what was said, and through face recognition, we know who said it and who was involved in the broadcast. We're beginning to pick up a really rich picture of everything that was happening in the studio. We'll come back to that later. The other thing we're able to use is to use social media to listen to what's happening. So if we look at the charts on the left-hand side, that's our sentiment tracking. So there you can just about see an orange wiggly line, which is showing for a music station. We can tell that because I can see the individual songs that were being played across the bottom, and I can see the reaction to that of the audience over the top, who are overusing love, play, thank, happy, and great. So that's a way of actually tracking the sentiment of your audience in real time and overlaying it with the context of what was happening, understanding the mood and mind of your audience and the relationship they're having with your content. This was something we thought was great fun. It can be used for great evil. So if you make speech radio, if you make sort of news talk, you can use this to keep your audience as unhappy as possible, because that's the way that news radio, or in particular news talk shows, work, right? So if you're wondering why the world seems as angry and as divided as it is, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the sentiment worm. What we can do for news talk stations is make sure that your audience is as unhappy, or has what we call strength of feeling, the highest strength of feeling. So I change a topic to Trump or Brexit or something, and you'll see it spikes right down. And then you're riding a sawtooth that comes back up again, and we can just keep, basically we play whack-a-mole with happiness. And just make sure we keep people as angry as possible. Or you can use it to say, does your audience prefer Taylor Swift to Ed Sheeran, or use it for good or ill? The choice is yours. In the middle, I can see what my audience is talking to me, the broadcaster, about, the top 10 things they're talking up to me, the broadcaster, about. And then the last 5,000 people who message the station, I can see what they're talking to each other about. This is not Cambridge Analytica and the NSA. This is publicly available information that tells you not how to impose a conversation up here, but how to join a conversation that's already happening amongst your audience. More importantly, in news talk, it tells you that we probably, in radio and TV, care about studios care about content, news topics, way longer than the audience does. So what is your audience really talking to each other about? And go join a conversation rather than imposing one from the top down. So we have all of these different ways that we can use social media and information not to give us a bigger mouth, but to give us bigger ears, to understand what artists and newsmakers are saying, to understand what our audience is interested in and how they're reacting to the content that we're making. But armed with all of that stuff, what are we going to do? Because unfortunately, the way we've been making radio has been all wrong. One of the things the BBC came to us to say was, we can't keep making radio the way we're doing it, because the way we're doing it is destructive. Radio is made through a mixer, which is a really creative process of mixing all these sources together, but it's a destructive process. When you put everything together, you mash it together. We describe it like this. You've got some blueberries on the top, you've got some raspberries. For some reason in the picture I chose, there's like some kale or something underneath, and we blend it all together. Everybody gets a generic and reasonably pleasing blend. But what if Ian's allergic to the raspberries? Or what if you want the blueberries back next week to make a cake out of them? It's intrinsically a destructive process. But remember all that audio over IP stuff we talked about. It doesn't need to be that way. This is not a digital mixer, it's a digital unmixer. We designed a product called the multi-object recorder that all it needs to know is the IP address of a Fusion Axia console. The console tells us over all those protocols we heard about how large it is. It tells us over those protocols where all the sources are on the network. And then we go to all those sources on the network and we just start to write them down. That means we can do something like this. Welcome to one of our test studios here at Broadcast Bionics. I'm here in front of an Axia Fusion IP console, playout system, phone box and virtual director locked off. So you can see that everything I do on this standard radio console is also being recorded up here. If I move the faders up and down, the multi-object recorder has observed, measured, and is now monitoring this desk. So anything I do on here is going to be recorded. So let me open the faders and fire in a track like this. You're listening to the output of this, but if you follow along, you'll see everything I'm doing as I'm ducking the start of this Queen track. is being faithfully recorded and recreated. Let's take something and fire it out on the Hotkey channel.
This is the best 80s music has sounded since 2010.
Absolute 80s.
The UK's only 80s radio station.
So that leaves me 29 seconds to show you that these ducks and fades are all being recreated. So we're going to switch you now to look at this being played back in multitrack as we get towards the vocal. And now you can see that the virtual faders that were recorded are being recreated. And what you're listening to is not a recording of the desk. It's Audition recreating everything I did so you can hear me talk up to the vocal just like that. So when everything's data, when everything's on a computer and everything's on the network, the live output is just one of many options of what we can do with everything that happens in the studio. So this is an Adobe Audition session made by that relatively standard looking radio studio. And remember, in all that I'm talking about, I don't want to change the art and craft of radio. I'm talking about changing radio to simplify it, not to add more knobs and buttons. So you just walk into a standard radio studio, you open a standard fader, talking to a standard microphone, and everything else you're seeing just happens automatically in the background because everything's on the network, it's all data, and it's all a computer. So this is the Adobe session, and you can see some quite interesting things. The computer automatically looks at the mixing desk, and every time I assign a source, it simply starts to grab that source from the network, because everything's on the network, right? It's pure IP. But I don't start recording it immediately. It goes into a buffer for 6 seconds, then I throw it away. It goes into a buffer for 6 seconds, I throw it away. When the fader opens and some audio arrives, I wait a little bit to make sure something's really happening, and then it starts to record it. Well, that means it sounds bad because it starts recording late, but because it has a 6 second time machine, everything you do in your studio is automatically recorded 3 seconds before you knew you were going to do it. Does that make sense? Because we have a time machine. So you'll see here's where I opened the fader, here's where the audio started, but we actually started recording here. You'll see it's doing that automatically on all of the tracks. So if I zoom into the little bit where we were just going into the intro of Queen, so if we zoom into the beginning, if we click in here, you'll hear the Queen track there, and just watch the fader as my hand moves up there. You're listening to the output of this, but if you follow along, you'll see everything I'm doing as I'm done. So that's not a recording of the studio. Now we're just emulating everything we did to prove that, and I'll get rid of the Queen track and replace it with some lovely Celine Dion. The start of this track is being faithfully recorded and recreated. Let's take something and fire it out on. So we'll change the brand by swapping out the branding. So not Absolute 80s, will be the Gift FM.
607. Email studio@thegiftfm.com or follow @thegiftfm on Twitter.
So that leaves me 29 seconds. So I can take a rock show and turn it into a country music show. I can take a 1 hour show and turn it into a series of 10-minute things just by taking it apart. To look at this so we can go back to Queen. Multi-track as we get towards the vocal. And now you can see that, or we can get rid of it altogether. Now you just got a clean feed of my voice. Are being recreated, and what you're listening to is not a recording. Or the computer will automatically backtime Celine Dion, so it sounds like I talk exactly up to the vocal on her. Up to the vocal, just like that. Or did I? You'll never know. That's the point. So I can miss the beginning of something, I can miss the end of something. I can start with country and I can turn it into rock. I can start with 4 hours and take it just down to 10 minutes. The point is, we can do whatever it is we do today, but we can do it better and we can do it faster. And if you absolutely have to, you can do it cheaper. Please just do it even better and even faster. So this is what we're working on. It's an idea called object-based radio. It's as simple as this. You take objects. The objects are the audio, the little audio stems that automatically come off that pure IP network. We take the video that we shot automatically in the studio over Virtual Director. We take images. Virtual Director is taking images every time we switch cameras to identify people and making those images available. That's all captured just automatically off that live wire network. We then have a layer on top of that that we call telemetry. The telemetry is the art and craft of radio. It's all those things you did live in the studio, EQ, dynamics, bus assignments, all of that stuff. Back to the fruit smoothie, it's as simple as ingredients and recipe. If you put the same ingredients through the same recipe, looks and tastes exactly the same. But now we can change the recipe or we can change the ingredients and do completely different things with it. Fruit smoothie analogy about to get stretched to the absolute limit now, ladies and gentlemen, as we get to annotations. So this is the stuff which is happening with your media. This is the stuff that makes your studio bionic. We're also remembering transcribing all of that audio that happened in the studio, recognizing the faces. automatically. We call that layer annotation. Annotation is like the little box the strawberries came in that has small print on that tells you the sell by date, the calorific information, the origin, all that, what's inside it. So we have all these objects, we have this telemetry, but what is it and where is it? And we're in a really good position inside Phonebox or the Bionic Studio because we know all the callers, we know the topics that you're talking about, we have the transcription data, we have the face recognition data. So we can do a really, really good job of generating this annotation layer. You've probably always historically called it metadata, and everybody's too lazy to make it. So the point is, a Bionic Studio is going out there and automatically generating all of this metadata to automatically describe everything that happened. And along the way, it's unmixing everything to make it available. So you have access to all of those raw ingredients. You can remix the telemetry or you can change the ingredients. And the top layer we have on top of that is what we call events. That's the stuff you actually understand. Oddly, one of the first things the BBC came to us about that led to some of this work is they didn't even know when their own programs started and finished. If you think about it in continuous linear output, it's actually quite hard to do. Which studio is it from? Does it have a cold open? Does it overlap with the show before? When do your shows begin and when do they end? And that's what happens in the event layer. So on top of all of this stuff is the human understandable description, the beginning and end of a program. We also can do using artificial intelligence. Remember, we've got that transcription data. We can actually tell when you start talking about a new topic or when the program changes segment. So all of that stuff together helps to produce what the BBC wanted, which was internet fit radio. One of the things the BBC wanted to do as part of their charter renewal and the promises they make both around content and about helping the broadcast industry was to understand and fit some studios that really would help radio that was fit for the internet. But nobody really knew what that meant. So as we started to build the studio with the technology that we're describing, the BBC have built an internet-fit radio studio in an old Radio 3 studio, which is landlocked in the middle of Old Broadcasting House. It has no daylight because it has no windows, but we're going to send them some cushions. We wanted to understand, what does it mean to make radio that's fit for the internet? So I went back to first principles and said, what even is the internet? The internet is just a series of searchable, linkable documents. That's all it is. It started from HTML, hypertext markup languages. So one document that can link to another document. Well, that's why radio can't play its part, because radio isn't a document. It's just a squiggly line. It's a waveform. But when you accurately transcribe radio, then really radio becomes a spoken document. That's all it is. Live radio is actually just a spoken document. So if we transcribe it accurately enough, it just becomes a document that can play its part on the internet. If we put some pictures on it, the pictures don't help with the document, but they help with the transport of the document to the places which have searching and serendipity options, be that Facebook, be that sharing options through social media, or search on things like YouTube. So we've got pictures and now we've got a document. But then what we realize is we can do something even smarter than that in a Bionic Studio, because radio is a self-describing document. Unlike you guys in TV have all those pesky pictures, in radio, everything you need to know to understand a piece of radio is encoded inside the document. It has to be, right? Otherwise you couldn't listen at home. There's no other source of information. So if I'm sat in my kitchen, all the information I need to know to consume that piece of content is embedded inside the content itself. It's a self-describing document. So we wanted to produce another surface, we call it the portal. And the idea of the portal is it allows you to use artificial intelligence to look inside radio. You can do a live breakfast program as we have here. So this is a music show, and you'll see it's automatically pulling all of those different surfaces of information. So I can see the music, I can see still images for who was speaking, metadata from the callers, here's my host, here's the guests ringing in. All of that information coming in automatically. I can then see that across multiple tracks. So I can say, no, I just want the music, or I just want something else. I can see a heat map of how the social media activity or sentiment changed as that was going on. And it even understands, so here we've talked about Tom Smith. Who the hell is Tom Smith? There he is. And in fact, that's how many times we've mentioned him. Here's everywhere else we've used him during the week. So could you just get me a compilation of every time we talked about Tom Smith? Could be how many times we've said Netflix in a commercial environment. So let's take all of that content which is locked up in our passive studios, and let's use that to allow us to service content out to these sharing platforms and all of the different uses that radio has to be put to. Let's use our existing content to help us make and understand and deliver better content. It's what we call the Bionic portal. So at NAB this year, we showed another couple of things. One is Skype TX, which is a partnership between us and Microsoft going back a couple of years. We launched Skype TX for radio, which is a radio-specific version of Skype TX at the previous NAB, and that allows you to really easily use 14 Skype codecs in a broadcast environment and pull the audio just straight into the console as quickly and easily as possible. So I ring in from my phone, all I have to do is click and the audio's on the device.
Hi, so this is a high quality call coming in over Skype.
Or if I click on a line that's not doing anything, I get the Skype dialer, I have full control of the directory, etc. And we use that to help broadcasters to get Skype contributions.
Welcome to Skype or testing service. After the beep, please record a message. Afterwards,
So at NAB this year, though, we wanted to add Skype TX for radio in brackets with a little bit of video. Because when we started working with Microsoft, we said, look, TV has a very expensive box called Skype TX. It's brilliant. It works really, really well for TV broadcasters. But there's actually no natural format in which broadcasters really regularly use listener-driven content. But in radio, we do it all the time. The problem is we do a lot of it with a lot of callers, and we have no money. But we do have a workflow that we know works, and if we can build it into that, then we'll really use Skype in broadcast for radio. Microsoft were kind enough to help us to do that, and we collaborated, and Skype TX for radio was born. The problem is, during the time we developed that, we'd done this whole virtual director and Bionic director thing, and we really needed a little bit of video. So now, as of NAB this year, you can slide out a menu and promote something to video, and then as the Skype caller speaks, we automatically switch to them, still transcribed all the other stuff that we've spoken about. But we'd actually been working on another idea for almost exactly 11 years. 11 years ago, after Phonebox first sort of became successful around the world, I wanted to solve another problem, which is how to get high quality audio from the listeners at home into the studio. And we found a crazy piece of Russian software that we could use as a codec running inside Flash. So on your webpage, you could put a little thing, when you pressed it, you were connected to the studio, and it worked in high quality, and it was brilliant, and it was going to change the world. Until Steve Jobs pulled the iPhone out of his pocket about 3 weeks later and announced that Flash was dead. And so was the idea of what the product was that we developed at that time called Anywhere. And we persisted, because we're dumb, but we're eventually teachable, for about a year trying to go with a product that didn't work on the iPhone, because we were pointing out to broadcasters that the iPhone is in fact occasionally used as a phone. So if they had an iPhone, they could use the phone part of it, but it didn't work because the whole premise was high quality audio. Well, we're patient folk, and 11 years later, in October of last year, iOS through Safari on iPhones and iPads started to include a codec for a thing called WebRTC. Now, I'm not going to get technical with the algorithms, but WebRTC is a really interesting part of HTML5. It gives you a really high quality, really low latency audio and video codec on every device on Earth. Every phone, every tablet, every PC. It can be iOS, it can be Android, it can be Windows, it can be Linux, it can be OS X, doesn't matter. It can be Internet Explorer, it can be Chrome. If you can get and load a web page on those devices, we can connect it through in high quality to the studio. So what we've added is something we call Anywhere, which is the ability to send an invitation. So it can be to an email address, it can be to a mobile phone number as a text message through social media. When you receive the invitation at the other end, it simply loads onto your device. In this case, this bit on the right is emulating my phone. So when I accept the invitation and connect to the studio, this would normally be filled in automatically. We would skip that stage, or you can just put a link on the website and people can connect directly to the studio. There's my call coming in from any device, anywhere in the world. And when I click on it, I have HD. I have a high quality audio codec. The default setting is 48K Opus Mono, which is a really, really good sounding voice codec, much, much better than a standard telephone call. So now we can use complete standards. It's not just AES-67 and stuff that's happening in the studio. Every codec, every device, every web browser has these codecs built into them anywhere in the world. So just use the fact that every one of your reporters in their pocket has a device that has these codecs and controls built into them. So there's 3 different kinds of invitations you can send out. You can send it to a guest that will time out, say, after 24 hours and say, I'd like you to be on my show tomorrow. Just click here and you're connected in high quality. I can send it to Peter, who's a regular contributor or a member of my staff, and he can connect to any of my studios at any time. And he also gets control and access to the text chat channel in the studio. He can see the social media information they're now playing. So he has essentially a full remote studio in his pocket. Or we can put a button on the website and then anybody who clicks on your website is connected in high quality. Audio presently, audio plus video from IBC in September. So that's the thing we call Anywhere. But I'll leave you with one more bit of fun that we've been talking to broadcasters around. It's something we introduced I think we showed it at IBC. I think we showed it here at SIMPTE like about 6 months before that. We didn't know when we brought it to SIMPTE that you didn't have Amazon Alexa at that time. So it caused a bit of confusion because people thought we were wizards. But anyway, Amazon is slowly rolling out these little things, not the little children behind, but hopefully you can see there's a little black Alexa in the middle there. We've had them for around 2 years, US around about 2 years, 6 months. There's around about 10 million in the UK, probably around about 50 million. I have no idea, they sell like crazy. These things are essentially really, really good little radios. But more importantly, they're changing the entire role that the audio has in our home and our relationship with it. And that's important to those of us who are in the media business. The effect they're having, particularly on children, is utterly magical. I first discovered that through Tom. Tom is the son of one of our support engineers called Sim. Tom, I think aged about 3 at the time, would sit in the back of the car and just start shouting for Alexa. No idea that it only worked in the home, because once you get used to it, it's utterly magical. Dean, another of our support engineers, his daughter was walking through the woods on a camping holiday. Just start shouting for weather information, because why wouldn't you when you get used at the age of 3 or 4 to information just being everywhere? In the office, we've invented another part of the English language. I call it Alexa Tourette's, which is inappropriately shouting for information when it can't possibly be sated, but because you believe that all you have to do is shout. Hunter Walk, a US blogger, described it like this: these devices for young children are absolutely magical, but he's scared that it's turning his daughter into a raging arsehole. These devices are having the same effect on young people's politeness as emoji did on our spelling and punctuation. See, all you have to do is shout and information or music and stuff comes out. But that doesn't matter to us. What matters to us is people listen to the radio more with one of these devices. 77% of people who are at any point consuming media through these devices will have listened to the radio. More importantly, others are spending billions. We can't fight as broadcasters with all of these different platforms and all of these different tech companies. This is happening whether we like it or not. But people are already consuming our content, and if we get on board, then we have all of these new radio and audio devices at the center of people's homes and lives. Because these things are actually not just coming to our cars and coming to our living rooms, but they're going to be the center of what's called ambient computing. You will walk into this room and you won't know where the microphone is, but actually, you know, Tom was right. Dean's daughter was right. You will just speak and something, a microphone somewhere. GE in the US have just launched light bulbs that have microphones in. So you can just put it in the ceiling. You walk in the kitchen, you speak. Maybe the fridge heard you, maybe the toaster heard you. It doesn't matter. There are just microphones everywhere in this ambient world, and you speak. The great news for us in the audio business, in the radio business, is it is very likely that we don't want screens everywhere. What we want in ambient computing is voice. And we're really, really good at voice. We're in the audio business. We're already in the voice interface business. This is a huge opportunity for broadcasters. So we wanted to show you a fun way that broadcasters could take advantage of that. How can we make radio as natural an interaction on these modern smart speakers as it was to us growing up? Put it into the habits and the habitats of a modern audience. Now, I love radio. I hope I've covered that. But there are 2 problems in radio, which are nothing to do with the intimacy and immediacy of our content. That's great. But they're limitations of a platform that's 90 years old. And there are 2 things. The first one is that radio is quite high friction. That's what to design types like me means it's not a very good experience if you want to interact. It's high friction. So remember, you as a broadcaster have done something that made me laugh or made me cry or made me angry. That's good. Share that. Remember that from earlier on. But I, as the listener, want to interact and tell you about it. Problem is, if I'm listening on the radio, I can't talk through the radio, although people have been shouting at it for years. Hold that thought. But I need to go and find another device, can't use the radio, and another piece of information. I need to know your text number or your phone number. Then I need to call you. Then I need to speak to somebody else. And you know what? Nobody's going to do that these days. But we have been shouting at the radio for the last 90 years. And now we have these little boxes that can hear you.
Alexa, tell the studio I'm happy today.
Would you like to send the following message? I'm happy today.
Yes.
Message sent.
And it's a bit small, but there at the top right, you can see inside phone box, alongside your social media, alongside your calls, your listeners can now shout at the radio and we can hear you. Now, you'll notice there's a control in there that we don't just send it. If you just shout, if you're just speaking and you're going, oh, tell Radio New Zealand that's, and then you say, it doesn't go, thank you, I've told the student, what? You have to be very careful in voice interaction that you don't surprise people. The BBC call it being creepy wizard. So I don't know if you remember that thing at the back end of last year where people who had Alexas and they just started laughing manically. I don't know if you saw that, it was in the press. Both in the UK and Australia, they put an update out that if you said Alexa laugh, Alexa would start going, The problem is when you have an Alexa, you get false invocations where she thinks she heard something, but she didn't. Turns out Alexa laugh gets invoked quite a lot. So Simon and I may be in the kitchen just chatting, and suddenly in the corner, Alexa just goes, and we have no idea that it's going to happen. That's creepy wizard. It took them less than 24 hours to change it. Now you have to say, Alexa, can you laugh? And Alexa says, yes, I can laugh, and then she laughs. So we have to be careful that we don't confound people's expectations, but we do have, I think, as radio broadcasters, this expectation of immediacy, of intimacy, of interaction, and yet we've got these devices which people are using to consume radio more and more and more. Let's gamify that. Let's use the fact that if people shout at the radio, now we can hear you. The other thing is what I call frustration. That's in the studio, we have all this information, all this knowledge that the listeners might want, but we don't know who wants the information and when they want it. So if you're broadcasting a really, really good interview and I join 2 minutes late, I might have to wait 10 or 15 minutes before we say our guest today is Simon Jackson. Well, we know that information in a Bionic studio, in an intelligent studio. We have face recognition, we have all this metadata. So we wanted to build a way that you could ask the radio questions. So we built a language element which sits on top of the Alexa language model and adds just information, knowledge, semantic understanding of places, people, things, shows, guests, all of the stuff, all of the knowledge about what makes radio. And then understands through natural questions, there's no right way of asking, a wrong way of asking, how someone might be expressing an opinion or a sentiment, asking for a music request, or just shouting at the radio to send a message. So here's some examples of things you can do.
Alexa, tell the studio I love this song.
We love this song too.
Alexa, tell the studio I hate this song.
Sorry about that. Thanks for letting us know.
Alexa, ask the studio for traffic news.
Congestion. Up
Alexa,
to 15 minutes.
Stop. Alexa, tell the studio shouting at the radio is fun.
Would you like to send the following message? Shouting at the radio is fun.
Yes.
Message sent.
So there are incredible new opportunities available on these devices. The great news is you don't have to do very much. Just make sure you make a basic skill and get your content on these platforms. People can already listen using TuneIn or other things that are baked into the device, but your own skill with your own brand and your own voice will really improve that experience. Add 2 lines of code at the bottom of that skill. Our language engine can turn that into a completely unique and interactive experience. So I'll close by talking about one last project that we've worked with the BBC on. It predates the Internet Fit Studio and all of this stuff by many years because it's taken a long time to come to fruition. But for about 8 years, we've been working with the BBC on solving a very particular problem they had with BBC Local Radio. BBC Local Radio comes from around 40 different sets of studios and completely independent locations, geographically dispersed right around the UK. The problem was that it was taking them 15 years to go around and rebuild all of those 40 different locations. About every 5 years they would re-template, they would redesign perhaps the tech that was being rolled out. But if your station was right at the end, it might be 15, almost 20 years before your station got refitted. It was really expensive to do, and with the internet less than 15 years old, with social media less than 15 years old, we can't take 15 years to be upgrading individual sites and stations with new capabilities. They didn't have the physical space in the studios, they didn't have the physical racks room. As Peter said, there was over 500 racks of information spread right throughout the UK. So we thought we could use pure IP to do that in a completely different way. Loads of people are networking radio, they're pulling all the operations into central locations and broadcasting everything from there. But the BBC has a particular need to leave the editorial and the content at the edge. What if all we had to do was to bring the technology, the engineering from the edge to the centre and leave everything else out there?
Vilo for me is about a clever and value for money way of guaranteeing BBC Local Radio in the future.
For us as a team, Vylor will mean an even closer relationship with our audience.
Vylor's about giving BBC Local Radio the equipment that it needs to make the best programmes possible.
.21, BBC Three Counties Radio, back to the 80s now. Elton John, I'm Still Standing.
The BBC Local Radio Service is an extensive one. 41 broadcast centres across England, broadcasting around the clock. Some of our local radio stations now have technology that is more than 25 years old. And frankly, it's becoming unreliable. And that's a real worry for me because our local radio stations have a special responsibility to broadcast in times of emergency. What Vylor will give us is a way of refreshing all of those technologies station by station at once without the individual cost mounting up by doing repeated refreshments site by site. And it will also deliver a much more energy efficient solution.
So what is Vylor? It's virtual local radio and I'm standing in front of it. This is one of the 2 engine rooms that's going to power local radio into the future. This is in Birmingham, the other one's in London. In the stations, we're going to remove several hundred bays of ancient kit, and instead in the studios you'll have software and control surfaces that will remotely control the equipment behind me. Along the way, we've done a pilot in Radio Northampton. We used it on air for about 165 hours with no major on-air incidents, so we know it works.
So what we have here is a 3-column design. You've got phone lines coming in and out, so this is all the telephony for the studio areas.
Our audience here in Northamptonshire, like audiences everywhere, are increasingly finding new and different ways to communicate with us and to share things with us. Social media, Twitter, Facebook, Skype, as well as all of the other phone calls, emails, everything that we've traditionally used. And what this means is we'll have all of those things in one place for our producers and presenters to use.
The great thing about Vylor is that it's designed by local radio people for local radio people. So right from the outset, local radio presenters, local radio engineers have been involved in the planning, the design, the concept of Vylor. And all through the testing phase, we've involved presenters, they've given their opinions, they've changed things. So by the end, we've got something that really works, that for the first time ever is designed by English regions for local radio.
Northamptonshire Travel. BBC Radio Northampton.
Yeah, lovely. And can I get your name? Can I say call through?
I don't really know what hellebores are.
Vylor is a complex and challenging project to deliver. I'm really proud of the team here in Birmingham, particularly for the level of innovation that they've managed to deliver successfully, but also for the way they have run a complex set of relationships, first of all with the 1,000+ staff who all have views on what they might need from their local radio station in the future, but also for the way they've successfully delivered quite a complex web of relationships both inside the BBC and with the outside suppliers.
The Vylor project is a unique project and something that I've never heard of being achieved anywhere else in the world. The BBC have taken an approach where they've been working with suppliers, best-in-breed suppliers. They've collaborated with those suppliers to take existing product, to develop that product, to make it work for the Vylor project.
And when we piloted it here at BBC Radio Northampton, our audience, unprompted, got in contact with us to tell us they'd noticed an improvement in the quality of our sound.
Hello, welcome to BBC Essex. This is Louise Briley, and
it's a guaranteed future for BBC Local Radio. It's a future which is more efficient in terms of the way we spend the BBC's money and resources, and it's about delivering a new technology that I think will set a standard for the rest of the world.
For us as a team, what Vylor will mean is we have exactly what we need to have an even closer relationship with our audience.
Vylor's about making sure that BBC Local Radio has the best kit, the best equipment to make the best programmes possible.
So that slightly melodramatic video was made by the BBC in 2014 for an Innovation Award thing with the IBC. So it's now a little bit out of date. As I speak to you, and it changes all the time, but it's 30 out of 40 of those local radio stations are now on air 24/7 with nothing physically in the studio at all, except essentially a slab of console, which is just a keyboard. There's nothing in that console. The console's controlling audio 50, 80, 100, 500 miles away. All you have in the studio is a pair of headphones, some monitor speakers, and the microphones. Everything else, the playout system, the phone system, the outside sources, the codecs are shared from those two different VLRCs. So when we virtualize things, we don't have to centralize everything. We can leave the editorial, we can leave the content where it really should be, at the edge where the listeners are. But we can make an incredible saving in terms of air conditioning, in terms of power, in terms of all of those other things. So that's pretty much the end, but I promise my co-presenters I always put at least one different slide in, so I had to sneak one in the end, which is to encourage you to join what I call the creative conspiracy. I'm a nerdy engineering type and a designer, but I think back in its heyday, in the golden age of radio, radio was a creative conspiracy, when the nerdy engineering types like me that just stare at their shoes conspire with the egomaniacs and all the creativity that's happening in the studio. We can do incredible and compelling things. That's when our content was absolutely at its best. Something happened, something broke about 20 years ago when they moved all of the engineers to an air-conditioned building and centralized them somewhere else. The talent got afraid of engineering because they think we're just trying to automate everything, and the engineers hate the talent because we just think they're going to break everything. Let's get back to the golden age of radio, and let's make sure that through this creative conspiracy, we're really creating intelligent, bionic, smart studios that allow us to create compelling, original content in ways that don't just delight the audience, but enable and empower the audience to share that content on the platforms and the places that they really want to, that we can consume that content through searching and serendipity, and we understand and have insight to measure and monetize that content to enable us to have the sponsorship and the commercial relationships we need in an increasingly competitive environment. That's what we call the Bionic Studio, and I think it means radio has at least another 90 exciting years ahead of us. Thank you very much for your patience. Over to Ian or somebody else.